Okay, so welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for our first journal club of the year, which will be given by none other than APRA's founder, Marco Aqil, without whom we would all not be sitting here today. So we're very thrilled to have him here. So APRA is the Amsterdam Psychedelic Research Association, as I think most of you here know, academic non-profit here in Amsterdam with the focus on psychedelics and altered states of consciousness research. We organize journal clubs, lectures, and symposia around psychedelic science. We take an interdisciplinary approach, so ranging from neuroscience, psychology, psychiatry, to the humanities like anthropology, philosophy, and everything in between. For today's journal club, we'll be discussing Marco's paper, which he wrote with Lior Roosman, which is titled More Than Meets the Eye.
Good enough.
More Than Meets the Eye. I forget the rest, but I think it's a very interesting paper that really, it's the sensory dimensions. Anyway, it really makes an interesting point. I think that there's been a lot of emphasis on these high-level processes of cognition. I think we all have at least heard of the default mode network, like predictive processing, stuff like that, kind of as explanatory mechanisms for the subjective effects of psychedelics. And I think his article really kind of states the case in a pretty compelling way that we might be able to learn more by also focusing on these basic low-level sensory processes and how they interact with the more high-level processes. So without further ado, here's Marco, and then let's give him a warm applause.
Thank you. Thank you, Kenan, for the very nice introduction and very good summary of the paper. Thank you guys for being here. I appreciate it. So I'm Marco Aqil. I am the founder of this organization, and we started. So this, what is it? 26 Journal Club 26.
Yes, 26.
Yeah, the last Journal Club that I gave was Journal Club 2 in 2017. So it's been a while. It's great to see that we're still doing journal clubs, Kenan already explained a little bit about APRA. Is everybody here for the first time, or is it the first kind of event that you joined for or not? No? Okay. So it's a non-profit organization based on volunteer work. So, and one of the goals was to make it very welcoming and very easy for people to get involved and to contribute and to bring their ideas to the table. So feel free to talk to Kenan, I guess, after this if you want to be more actively involved. We like when people are members. It's even better when people are active members if they do something. That's great. So my background is in physics and math mostly originally, and then now been doing my PhD at a place called Spinoza Centre for Neuroimaging for the past 4-something years. Takes some time. In mostly computational modeling, fMRI, I'm mostly focusing on vision. And this is a paper that I wrote initially for fun. It's not part of my PhD. I started writing it when I had COVID last year in December. I got COVID like the day before Christmas, and so at least I had something better to do. I had a number of ideas about these topics, about sensory dimensions in psychedelic experience, and I just started writing them down. And then eventually Lior Roosman got involved as well, and then we published it more recently. Feel free to jump in if you have any questions or anything that is not clear. So you can find, I think I have the paper. Yeah, okay. There's some nice visuals in this talk, I like to think, because, it's a talk about hallucinations and the visual aspects of psychedelics, so I had to, try to make it entertaining from that point of view as well. We'll be talking about visual hallucinations in the context of psychedelics. the relationship between different dimensions of experience, so between this kind of low-level sensory processes and what is generally thought of high-level cognitive processes. And then I will be talking in the last part about the clinical relevance of everything else that is in the talk before that. So this is the paper. You can find it online. I see some they've printed as well. That's great. Love to see that. Yeah, I guess you read it beforehand. That's great. If you haven't, that's fine as well, but better if you did. Yeah, you can find it online. So let's talk about visual hallucinations. You can see almost the whole screen. That's nice. So as you probably all know, visual hallucinations are a very common feature of psychedelic states. More technically, they should be called pseudo-hallucinations. The distinction is that hallucination is something that is not distinct from your everyday reality perception. So if I am having an actual hallucinations of a glass of water here, I would try to grab it and do something with it, but then it wouldn't work. So that is a proper hallucination. What happens with psychedelics most of the time, not 100% of the time, because a lot of things happen, is pseudo-hallucinations. And the difference is that there is the distinction of the sense of reality is maintained. So the hallucinations elicited by psychedelics most of the time are recognized as not being of the same nature as the perception of everyday reality. Most of the time. Don't want to say always, but. So an important direction in the space of all possible hallucinations is the one that ranges from abstract hallucinations to figurative, sometimes called simple and complex hallucinations, but I prefer abstract and figurative. These are some examples. This would be an abstract kind of hallucinations. This would be a more figurative, so a scene with objects or animals, people. And this is not so much a binary distinction. That's why I had the dots in between. It's a range of or a spectrum. So abstract hallucinations elicited by psychedelics are geometric patterns, often with radial symmetry. A lot of details, a lot of fractal properties, often regular motion. These are some examples of just nice features that's somewhat are in the ballpark of psychedelics abstract hallucinations. So one thing that is interesting about abstract hallucinations is that they're reported cross-culturally, so they don't seem to be very much influenced by a specific setting. But they are specific to psychedelics in the sense that they are not very often reported in other classes of hallucinogens like dissociatives or, for example, delirants, like anticholinergic hallucinogens. So there's some interesting properties here that already suggest that there's a potential biological basis for this kind of hallucinations. I mean, of course, everything has a biological basis at some point, but you get what I mean, like a more intrinsic biological basis. So what do we know about abstract hallucinations and how they arise? We know that serotonin 2A receptors that psychedelics act on is very densely expressed in the primary visual cortex and throughout the whole visual system in general. It's also known mostly from neurophysiology studies that the serotonin 2A receptor is involved in the processing of visual input. So it's not just there like randomly, like by doing something else. It is involved in visual computations. This is also stuff from a number of modeling studies. These ones that I'm referring to are from Breslov and Cowan, where they essentially show that when you have a certain pattern of anatomical connectivity, which is called lateral connectivity, and that is combined with neural dynamics of exciter and inhibitory neurons, that can lead to via Turing instability to the self-organization of regular patterns of activity. For example, lines and grids. We also know that this is just the primary visual cortex, but there's many other cortical racinotopic mappings, but the primary visual cortex has a specific mapping to the experience, to the subjective experience of the visual world, such that this is of course, this is always a simplified representation, but if you imagine having this kind of pattern of neural activity in your primary visual cortex, so this would be like your right hemisphere, primary visual cortex and left hemisphere, this would be the corresponding subjective experience. So you can see if you have a simple pattern of lines or grids that can arise via Turing instabilities can self-organize. When there is a lot of excitation, corresponds to this subjective experience pattern with this kind of radial symmetry. which are quite similar to what is observed with psychedelics. Yes? So far, yes?
So are there any other specific techniques to trigger this kind of effect?
Phosphenes.
Sorry?
Phosphenes, you can do stuff with light.
Okay.
Yeah. You can have geometric hallucinations with certain frequency, using certain frequency of light. Yeah. Not as intense, not as detailed, not as a lot of things. Mm-hmm. It's a good question. So you can use some external mean to achieve to make these kind of patterns appear in the cortex, but there's a fundamental difference, I think, in that what happens with psychedelics is something that happens directly in the cortex, whereas if you use an external means to elicit these patterns, for example, these kind of stroboscopic lights, it still goes through the thalamus. And that is a crucial difference, because essentially the thalamus warns the rest of the cortex that stuff is coming. Whereas, and that is what happens in 99.9% of your life. All your senses go through the thalamus, right? Aside from olfaction. And so in 99.9% of your daily life, the cortex has a warning, and there's like a warning system that something is coming. But if something is happening directly in the cortex because you have hyperexcitation with stimulation of these two receptors, it could also happen spontaneously. There's people with famous like temporal lobe epilepsy. There were some older studies, now a bit more controversial, related to temporal lobe epilepsy and mystical experiences. Anyway, but if something happens directly in the cortex and it doesn't go through the thalamus, it's a very unusual situation for the cortex. So that I think is a fundamental difference between these kind of hallucinations happening in the cortex directly or being elicited from the outside. It's also a fundamental difference between psychedelics and VR. I think you can do a lot of things with VR. There's quite a lot of people working on clinical applications of VR, trying to reproduce features of psychedelic experience in VR with some success. But it's still something that comes from the outside. So I don't think it can have quite the same effect. So to go a little step beyond that kind of just static kind of patterns, this is a way of showing that this is something that I did for this paper, to show that the combination of motion and radial symmetry, which is common features of psychedelic hallucinations, can be achieved in a very simple bottom-up way. So if you have these two, you can imagine this is a pattern of neural activity on the cortex. This is of course just a simulation. It's not a real thing. If this is a pattern of activity in your visual cortex, this would be the corresponding subjective experience. So it's the same mapping that was here, but now it's just oscillating. So I have one pattern that is just oscillating with sinusoidally, and the other one as well. So on their own, this is what they would do. The combined effect of these two patterns is motion. So you can make the experience of motion in a very bottom-up way if you have two, let's just say two grids that are oscillating out of phase from each other. That makes motion. The reason why I was doing this is that does anybody know what the rebus paper, or is anybody? Yeah. So it's an influential model of how psychedelics work. It's called the rebus model by Carreteris and Freestone, and I can go along with most of the stuff that is in there. There's one thing one example that they make is that basically they say that maybe the experience of motion in a psychedelic experience can be generated in a top-down way, because if they make the example with the phenomenon of breathing walls, so that people sometimes see the walls as moving or as breathing, and they say, oh, maybe this is because your existing prior that walls don't breathe is relaxed, and so then you experience that walls are breathing. I think this, there could have been many other better examples of relaxation of prior doing something. I think there's much more simpler explanations for a phenomenon like experience of motion. If you have this kind of pattern happening in the cortex, it's still gonna be superimposed to a degree of the visual input. So you're gonna see this on top of a wall, and the wall is moving. And then the part that I think makes more sense in terms of priors is, maybe if you're prior relaxed, you will be more likely to interpret this motion as, as some kind of breathing. So at the level of interpretation, I think this whole idea of prior relaxation makes sense. Anyway, this is maybe a bit too much detail.
Can I go there?
Yeah, of course, sure.
So then the harmonic one would be like the wall, and the harmonic two would be the more like the breathing, the kind of how do I put this onto the wall example?
Right. So these would be both things that are happening. So there's no wall here, right? So this is just
the experience, so that the wall excites like.
So you can think about this as just patterns of neural activity. Let's say that you close your eyes and you have taken psychedelic. So there's no external input. If these two patterns of activity are happening at the same time in your cortex, this would be your experience. Let's say with your eyes closed, so no walls, no nothing. If you open your eyes, your cortex is going to continue to do this, and on top of that, there's going to be the external input of the wall. So this is just the stuff separated from the external input. So this is just the internal stuff that, or a plausible thing that psychedelics are doing. And then if you take this kind of subjective experience with eyes open, so with some other input, then it sort of intermixes, and then you see what is outside us moving, instead of just, if you close your eyes, you would just see like shapes moving. Then of course, if you're looking at, does that make sense?
Yeah. So then the harmonic one and the harmonic two are just activations of a brain region, but it's the same one.
Yes.
So it's like on top of each other.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So that would be the simpler way. The simpler way of thinking about it is just these two are happening. There could be. So there's many neuronal population. There's many neurons in the brain, and they don't need to all be doing. And there's inside each kind of local population of neurons. So if this was V1, this would be on the scale of centimeters. So these would be populations on the scale of 2 or 3 millimeters. There's 100,000 neurons in that. So you can have subpopulations that oscillate separately. They don't have to, especially because in early visual cortex there are these lateral connection between neurons with response to the same orientation, essentially. So there's this. That's why you can get this kind of pattern. So this is prior work. This kind of figure is from this paper, where they discuss how you can get this kind of patterns. And then the next step from that we make in this paper is to think, okay, if these patterns are oscillating, what would that do? And one answer is motion. There could be more complex way of this kind of stuff happening. For example, you could have because there's not only V1. V1 is not the entire visual system. It's just V1 is the primary visual cortex, for those of you that are not familiar. So it's the first region of the brain where visual input arrives. And it has this kind of phenotypic mapping. There's many other visual regions after V1 that also have this phenotypic mapping. So you could have that happening in V1 and this happening in V2, for example. And then it would lead to not exactly the same, but a similar result. So there would be another way to. So again, this is a simulation, right? There is no, this is not data. This is just a simulation to show it is plausible that this kind of thing could happen. Yeah. So to summarize about just part about abstract hallucinations, combine the activation of the serotonin receptor and the biological properties of the visual cortex. Oh, too fast. Explains this kind of geometric patterns and regular motion as well. And this is a purely bottom-up explanation, doesn't require any top-down effects. So, figurative hallucinations are also very interesting. Beautiful examples in these paintings by Pablo Amaringo, who I think is from Peru. I think he's a Peruvian shaman and ayahuasca painter. So these are visions inspired by ayahuasca. You can see a lot of figurative aspects in the people, animals, and even transforming into each other, plants, objects, spirits, places. So like this looks like a hall in some kind of palace or a church, whatever. This is a particularly interesting one because you can see that there is a combination of the kind of radial symmetry of the abstract visual hallucination that we were talking about, together with more figurative aspects. So this is very interesting. And I will, let's see if I have time. But, so yes, psychedelics also elicit figurative hallucinations, scenes, entities, animals, people. They're generally still pseudo-hallucinations. So this, most of the time during a psychedelic experience, even if you're seeing a person, you're aware that that person is not, you're not going there and trying to shake their hand. You know, you're not going there and going like this and trying to hug them. I don't want to say always, because I'm sure that someone can come up with my cousin, you know, once like tried to hug, you know. But most of the time, as opposed to other kind of hallucinogens like the deliriums, where essentially all the time you are confusing the percept for something that is actually there. So that is also interesting. And also figurative hallucinations still contain a degree of these abstract features of geometric visual hallucinations. So one thing that I think is interesting about figurative hallucinations is that they often, as opposed to abstract hallucinations, or they contain more themes and not just themes, but their very content is more specific to the person, to the individual and their culture. So they, for example, deities or spirits of the local religion, if you happen to be someone in a culture that worships jaguars, you know, famous examples that you think jaguars are a manifestation of gods, I think it's going to be more likely that you will experience jaguars in your figurative hallucinations, and so on. You can experience your own relatives, so on an individual level, on a cultural level, but more specific. So this suggests that there is some involvement of top-down mechanisms, unlike in the case of abstract hallucinations. So we know from a lot of anthropological studies the past 40 years, memories, beliefs, intentions, all these factors do influence not just the interpretation, but actually the content itself of figurative hallucinations. So not just the interpretation, but the content as well. This also implies that some high-level priors not only persist, but actually significantly contribute to shaping psychedelic experience, which is somewhat in contrast to the proposal of the rebus model. This also suggests that the top-down mechanisms of attention are directed primarily towards those aspects of visual experience or sensory experience more generally that are considered important by the specific individual. So I think a brief summary of this part: abstract hallucinations are more rooted in, let's say, in biological properties of the brain, in nature in that sense, and they arise most likely in a bottom-up way. Figurative hallucinations are more strongly influenced by culture, so they're likely to involve this top-down mechanism of attention and memories and priors. So there is a role for top-down effects, particularly in figurative hallucinations. Yeah, any questions before I move on to the next? Yeah. So there's a famous definition of psychedelics as non-specific amplifiers by Groff, 1974. It's a definition that I liked as well for a long time, and then I started liking it less because I think it applies depending on how you interpret it. Like most of the time it is. So if you interpret it as in a weaker sense, let's say, as just as saying psychedelics can do a lot of things, can elicit a wide variety of experiences, sure, I think it applies. If you interpret it more literally as psychedelics can elicit any experience with equal probability, I don't think it applies, because I don't think psychedelics just do like a blanket. You know, they don't sample randomly the space of all possible experiences. They take a specific slice of the space of possible experiences. So, and they are in terms of the different sensory modalities. Of course, there's pretty much all sensory modalities can be involved, but there is a pretty strong emphasis on visual sensory modality. Not only they're primarily visual, as we said before, their effect in the visual domain are distinct from other hallucinogens. However, essentially all of the recent models, like these rebus models, there's some other ones, the cortical, striatal, thalamic, cortical, again, model, and another one that is called claustrum, cortical, claustrum, cortical, something like that, are not specific, so they don't provide that much of an explanation of why a certain sensory modality should be more involved than others, or why there should be a specificity even within that sensory modality. So even within vision, again, it's not that psychedelics elicit any visual experience with equal probability. They elicit a certain set of experiences with a lot more probability. So I think it's necessary not to throw away these models for sure, but to integrate them with some considerations of what psychedelics are doing in specifically in low-level visual areas. And I think even if you're interested in high-level regions, high-level networks, high-level cognitive processes, it is important to take into account if there is a causal role of things of other phenomena that are happening at a lower level. So, yes, we know that psychedelics also elicit alteration in these so-called high-level dimensions of experience. Some example, they definitely elicit changes in the sense of self. They elicit the sense of awe, often the sense of connectedness, ineffability, mystery, reality, spiritual, mystical experiences. So reaching into the kind of even highest metaphysical levels, metaphysical beliefs. So a question that I think doesn't get asked often enough is whether there are relationships between these different components of experience, between the sensory components and this kind of high-level dimensions of experience. Because normally we treat them in psychology and neuroscience, they're treated as distinct. As on one hand, you have like your visual cortex does the visual stuff, and on the other side you have your high-level regions and networks, and they deal with this kind of higher-level aspects of experience. However, that's not quite how the brain works, and of course they both influence each other. And that is, I think it's important to ask those kind of questions in the future. And yes, so in contemporary research has not really asked this question, and the few times that this question gets asked is in psychedelics, has been thought of in the top-down direction. So for example, the rebus model says, okay, we have this relaxation of priors. How does that influence the low-level effects? It doesn't really ask the question of how the low-level effects influence the high-level priors, which I think is worth asking. There's certainly evidence that low-level alteration elicit changes in high-level dimensions of experience. For example, subjective experience is integrated. Do I have a timer just to know what time? How long am I going? So I don't rumble.
About 20 minutes.
Okay. Okay. So subjective experience is integrated. It's very unlikely that if you're experiencing your relatives being cooked in a nightmarish hellscape, you will be simultaneously reporting a blissful experience of ego dissolution, depending maybe on your relationship with your relatives. But it's generally unlikely. You get the point. There's a specific temporal progression to psychedelic experience. And there's quite a lot of evidence that alterations in low-level dimensions and the sensory dimension happen earlier in time, and they happen also at lower doses than high-level alterations, and also earlier in time than emotional alterations. So again, this is circumstantial evidence, not conclusive evidence, that there is this kind of bottom-up influence of low levels on high levels. So there is a possibility for that. And this, I think, is an important question to ask, that if you read the paper, you probably realize why I ask it. What would be the effect on high-level priors of an intense, immersive, complex, novel, unpredictable sensory experience? I can tell you what I think the answer should be. The answer is that priors should be relaxed. So if you have... So your priors are, let's say, your expectations about the world, your expectation about how the world is supposed to be, how the world is supposed to look like, and those are built on your life, on a lifetime of experiences. If suddenly you have an experience that is extremely intense, immersive, complex, novel, unpredictable, it's basically by the definitions of how even predictive coding itself works, that will have an impact on your prior. So you will have a chance of changing your pre-existing beliefs about the world. So I think there is a role again for this kind of low-level effects as a causal mechanism for what happens at the higher levels. So I think this I can kind of go through it quickly. You can make a lot of examples, especially if you look at the literature on trip reports, on ways in which, you can see the first letter, but you get self, the first one is self, the second one is awe, and then connectedness, of course. So the sense of self is, your sense of self in a daily life is built on your experience again. The experience that you have is first person, embodied. So you live in your body. It's very clear under normal circumstances where your body ends. You can see, you can feel in a very specific way. If suddenly you're visually and maybe from other senses as well, you have a complete rewrite of what your first person experience is. It's plausible to me that is a way to change your sense of self, essentially. But there's a lot of experience outside of psychedelics in neuroscience that you can change your sense of self with this kind of illusions. You can do the hand thing. You've probably seen it. It's classic. The sense of awe, I think, being immersed in this kind of the visual experiences that are happening directly in your cortex, the immersive aspect, I cannot emphasize it enough. I think being immersed in this kind of experience can elicit a sense of awe. I think the sense of connectedness is another aspect that can be related to what is happening in the sensory domains. But yeah, let's just move on. There's about all of these high level, not all of them, but a lot of these high level dimensions have building blocks that are sensory. So, and that doesn't really get taken into account that much in psychedelic research.
What would you say is the sensory building block for ineffability?
So, a picture is worth 1,000 words. It's a famous expression. There can be pictures that you cannot put into words, right? So I think just an example of that would be if you have a visual or a sensory experience more generally. That is, so normally we go through life, we learn how to associate visual experience to semantic, content. If suddenly you have a visual experience that you never had before, that you don't have a vocabulary for, that by definition elicits the feeling of ineffability because you cannot put it in words. So I think that is just the intensity, the unpredictability, the complexity of visual experience can elicit this kind of ineffability. The sense of reality as well, I think, is important, because we were saying that psychedelics still maintain, most of the time there's a sense that this is something, you're experiencing something different from everyday reality. Sometimes it gets experienced by people as more real than everyday reality. It's a common experience. Sometimes it also gets experienced as less real. But the important thing is that it's often, or I never want to say always, mm-hmm. When I say almost always, distinct from everyday reality. And then I think the way it gets interpreted, that is where like a top-down effects come into play. Mm-hmm. So the sensory building blocks make you experience it as, they make you experience it as other than everyday reality. And then whatever your beliefs are, your setting, how you're feeling that day, how you feel about the whole thing, influence whether you perceive it as more real or less real than everyday reality. Right. So I think these alterations in low-level and high-level dimensions do not happen in a vacuum with respect to each other. So they're not, one is in a box here, the other one is in another box here, but they coexist and they causally influence each other. And of course, in this whole paper, I focus on the influence of bottom-up on high-level effects, because other people have already described quite a lot the influence of high-level effects on low-level aspects, but they are both happening, I think. So, yeah, any questions before I move on to the next bit? Okay. So I think this is all quite relevant also for clinical aspects. There's quite a lot of debate these days that you're interested in psychedelic research. You're probably familiar with about whether the subjective experience elicited by psychedelics is it necessary for therapeutic benefits? Is it useful? Is it even counterproductive? Can we do without it? This is all part, if you take a little bit of a broader perspective, like kind of on the history of science, on the history of how narratives around psychedelics change in science. There is a trend, of course, which is in a way it's positive, in changing the image of psychedelics from something that has a negative connotation, like hallucinogens. So hallucinogen, if you go to an average person on the street, has a negative connotation because it's something that makes you see something that is not there. So it's wrong by definition. It's not useful by definition. Whereas you can come up with more favorable characterizations from psychedelics, entheogen, neuroplastogen, So something that appeals more to the, let's say, the spiritual field, something that appeals more to the neuroscience field, but these are all more positive characterizations. Now, you may know that there's there's several companies that are trying to develop non-hallucinogenic psychedelics with a variety of reasons why they are saying that they're doing that. But I don't think there is evidence to completely disregard the therapeutic role of sensory experience. These are just some examples. So spiritual experiences which are known to be valuable for therapeutic effects can often have this kind of sensory building blocks. So can be vision. So what people, at a high narrative level you might describe to a researcher, to your therapist as a spiritual experience, often actually has a very specific sense, something specific at the sensory level was happening. A vision of deities, entities, the universe as a whole, the white light again. You could be experiencing your past memories. You could have experiences with your dead, very common with dead relatives, emotional cathartic moments. So again, all these processes that have therapeutic valence are in a way set in motion by the sensory part of the experience. That doesn't, of course, everything that comes after is crucial, right? But you cannot I don't think you can just cut off the sensory part of the experience and just say, we still have a spiritual experience, but there's no content. Or again, no content is also content. It's not generally, you're not blacked out having go on.
Do we know if there are substances that do not cause any sensory distortions, but do cause a sense of awe, for instance?
A sense of awe, let me think.
Or mystical type experience.
So as far as I know, 5-MeO-DMT doesn't have quite the same. It's more. I'm not speaking from personal experience on 5-MeO-DMT. I'm speaking from what people say. As more of a white light kind of experience, and it is associated with mystical and spiritual kind of experiences. So.
But there is a break with normal sensory experience.
There is a break with your what you would be seeing through your eyes, but there is still a sensory experience. But again, I wouldn't claim that all spiritual experiences or all mystical experiences arise through some kind of something that is happening in your sensory domains. But I think the correlation is very strong. That's what I would say, and I think the causal relation. I think what would be interesting to do is to look at essentially the causal narrative structure in treat reports. And so this stuff that someone asked me in another talk about this, how this stuff that I'm saying, if it's because in the paper I criticize a little bit predictive coding for not being very falsifiable, and so people ask me, okay, is your stuff falsifiable? And I say, yes, sure. If you show me that in the vast majority of cases when people report spiritual experiences or all kind of experiences, there's no sensory. They're not connecting it with the sensory part of the experience at all. They're just saying, I just had an experience of awe, which again can happen. But if the vast majority, if you were to look through the three reports, the vast majority of cases, this kind of emotional, cathartic experiences, spiritual experiences, there is a sensory component. Doesn't mean that it cannot happen any other way. I think a good analogy that I thought about some weeks ago at another talk, because somebody had asked a question about this, was with music, for example. So I don't think I would be making a crazy claim if I claim something that the music can elicit a powerful emotional experience that can have a lasting impact on your life. At the same time, so I think it's hard to disagree with that. You can tell me if you disagree, but that doesn't mean that you cannot have an emotional, valuable experience without music. Of course you can. Or also it doesn't mean that you can listen to a certain kind of music and not have any emotional, any valuable response. But none of these two other claims imply that music cannot give you a valuable experience. So I would just make it's very basic level claim with the sensory visual components of psychedelics. The sense of insight is another one. So, yes, I think that there is definitely like therapeutic potential role for visual hallucinations in this changing of sense of self, sense of cause, sense of reality, reliving experiences in a different perspective. So the current protocol that is used in clinical trials is also quite different from the general, the ecological use. So I think there is quite a lot of value for clinical research in trying to explore a bit more, let's say, a wider variety of therapeutic protocols and of dosage, instead of trying to get rid of hallucinations as something that is not useful or not valuable. And of course, different protocols, different approaches can be helpful for different people. Blah, blah, blah. So yeah, so I think there's a lot of value for clinical research in delving a bit deeper into phenomenological richness of experience. So not just whether or not you experience hallucinations, for example, but what was the causal structure of things that happened after you experience hallucinations. Again, this doesn't mean that any sensory experience will be useful, valuable, relevant for therapeutic outcomes. It doesn't have to be. It can certainly not be. In the same way as you can listen to some music and you don't enjoy it. Actually, it's even you hate it. So it doesn't mean that any sensory experience will be useful. But it also that we shouldn't throw out the entire thing as irrelevant. And of course, integration in high-level narratives is a very important part of actually having any long-term benefit, I think, from psychedelics. So beyond just the experience, of course, these other aspects are important. So, yes, I think there's a lot of value in trying to understand this kind of interactions between dimensions of experience for future psychedelic therapies. Overall summary is the last thing. Visual hallucinations have both bottom-up and top-down components, and they arise from this interaction of natural, biological, kind of universal, human, probably universal up to like, let's say primate universal, maybe also non-primate universal aspects, and then and cultural aspects that are specific to the individual in their life and their culture. I think there's a lot of evidence that alterations in the dimensions causally influence high-level effects. And I think it's important to understand this for clinical aspects of psychedelics. Again, this is the paper, and thank you for listening. Yes.
All right.
Any further questions?
Yes. It jumped to me when you correlate the top-down, or rather when you correlate complex visual experiences with top-down structures. In my mind, what jumps out is that I've heard a lot about experiences that seem innately biologically tied, for example, recovering repressed memories. Or even just reliving memories would be something that in my mind, I instinctively associate more with biology than with culture.
Go on.
That's it.
No, I mean, in a general sense, yes, but it is your memories.
Yeah.
So, I said culture, and I would, so culture is one aspect of this kind of high-level priors. So this high-level phenomena are built throughout your life and depend on your personal life experiences. And your personal life experiences are partially determined by your culture, and then partially determined by what happened exact to you specifically within that culture. So, I think maybe the general phenomena that there are these kind of memories is biological in the sense that we all have memories, we all have mechanisms from memories. But it's something that has to happen in a top-down way. Yes, I don't see any other way.
So there you do self first work down towards an experience of a memory of the self.
So in the sense of, your primary visual system on its own doesn't really know about your memories. So I don't think that's something that can happen from your visual system like in a bottom-up way. Like it's something that it happens in your visual system, in the sense that there are other parts of your brain that are involved in projecting back these memories and reliving them in a sensory way. So again, I go back to that point, which is it's this one thing that I think is very striking and it's very valuable is the two things actually: the intensity of reliving these experiences of your life. If we're talking specifically about memories, and because they are very vivid in this condition, they're much more vivid than if you just think about it. If you think about that memory, and of course the different perspective that often you manage to have during a psychedelic experience is another thing that is very valuable, and another thing that while it probably happens at a high level in a sense, it is, I think, causally influenced by a lot of bottom-up effects. So I do think there's this of course there's a circular structure, but the whole point of this paper was really to like put in the block in this circle about the low-level effects. Yeah.
And there are 5 HD2A receptors throughout the brain, so it makes sense that it is on all the levels.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. They do mention. I mean, they do have it. They do have a sentence in the Rebus paper, for example, about there's like one sentence that says, we recognize that there's a lot of 5-HT2A receptors in the rest of the brain as well. So it's good that they put it in there, But, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, sure. So thanks. I think you make a very compelling case, argument to focus more on these low-level processes, and I really like how you phrased it, like as this dialogical interplay.
I think a phrase from Roseman there.
Oh, okay. Well, I thought that was a very nice way to phrase it. I wonder, you must have some thoughts on this, like how, with the current landscape of the field, how do you think people can go about studying this dialogical interplay? What would a study or set of studies look like to really get more of a grasp on what that interplay looks like? I
see what you mean. So there's many ways to approach this question, and I have no doubt that it will be done in the next, because you can approach it I can think of a whole spectrum of things that you could do. Let's say on one end, you could approach it from an anthropological perspective. So you could do, qualitative analysis of trip reports and try to understand, first of all, to test some things that I said, there is evidence for them already, but you could explicitly analyze them, and you could explicitly look whether indeed, for example, these abstract hallucinations are more, cross-cultural, fully cross-cultural. Is there some variation across cultures? Does one culture perceive more square visual hallucination, abstract, and the other one does more circles? You could try to do stuff like that. And then really what I think would be very interesting is, again, this causal structure of what is happening in the way people tell the story. So not just, there were hallucinations and or someone had a mystical experience, but what was the causal structure in the way that people experience it? So that this is more on the qualitative side of things. Even with trip reports, you could do all kinds of quantitative things as well, because there are language models that kind of analyze automatically. There is a very nice preprint that I saw actually after I published this paper. Otherwise, I would have cited it. But it's a preprint. It's not peer reviewed, but they do a very nice analysis of trip reports from Arrowweed from all drugs. So not just psychedelics. They take all drugs, and essentially they do like something similar to a principal component analysis. So this means trying to find, let's say you have a giant data set with a lot of words. Then you try to find the main directions of variations of this data. And the first principal component that they find has psychedelics on one end, and it has opiates on the other end, in terms of what drugs, and then all the drugs in the middle. And then it has visual sensory experience on one end, and pain and somatic suffering on the other end. So that is very interesting, because for me, obviously, because naively you would think, oh, maybe the first principal component is going to be from pain to something like euphoria, or description of happiness, or this like a more hedonistic kind of component of just pleasure. But it does not go there. It goes from pain to visual experience, essentially, which I want to email them and ask why it isn't published yet, because it's just a preprint. but it's a very nice analysis, and there's much more in this paper. It's not just this.
Yeah, I'm interested in reading that one.
Yeah. So this is another, again, so that's another aspect. So qualitative, quantitative with 3 reports. You could work with questionnaires. You can work with, with people that do retreats, and again, try to study like the causal structure of how, how things happen. You can, and then of course we can get to neuroscience, right? To like neuroimaging and all the, and of course there's a lot of things that you can do there as well. Directly during their experience, we can definitely do way better at characterizing phenomenology of experience even while it's happening. Can think of a couple of ways of doing that are feasible. You could, so when someone is doing an fMRI scan, they can't really do too much. They cannot type on a keyboard, although you could probably figure that out, but anyway, but they can press buttons, for example. So you could, make them press a button when they're having a more abstract kind of hallucination, and you can make them press a different button to say I'm having a figurative kind of hallucination. So then you would have not a real time, because it's not, it's not fully real time, but a much more fine-grained way to relate what is happening in the brain and what is happening at the subjective experience level. And that is feasible in terms of, you of course you're still limited, because again, there's probably, what you would have to do is you would have to make a keyboard of experiences basically. So you would have to, and then the person would have to, be trained on how to play it. So that you would have to first train, person to remember, which keys mean what, in terms of, and the more, actually the better, the more you were able to train someone, the more detail you could make this, right? At the most basic level, you could do like abstract hallucinations, figurative hallucinations, or something like that, or mystical experience, or something, or you could, if someone can memorize, 25, 30, different notes, on this experience keyboard, then it's a lot. It would be a lot more detailed. Yeah. So that's another thing you can do. I don't know if it's definitely feasible with what, for example, the people at Imperial are doing. I don't know if they're doing it, but So there's a lot of things you could do in neuroscience. You could test. So I showed those nice simulations of patterns oscillating in the visual system. You could try to measure those to see if you see these kind of patterns. That one is quite a bit hard. It would be quite a bit harder, but not impossible.
Yeah. I can also imagine just trying to gather more qualitative data in these clinical trials that are going on anyway, like with psilocybin, DMT, for example.
Yes.
I don't think it would be that much more work to also gather a little bit, at least superficial, some qualitative data as well.
Yes, more qualitative data. People, I hope people will come up with better questionnaires. The ASC questionnaire is nice, like it's not terrible, but it does have some issues, and I go into it a little bit in the paper, because, for example, in the low-level dimensions this is the altered state of consciousness questionnaire. If you've heard about it, it's widely used questionnaire for psychedelic experiences and other drugs. And there's a variant with 5 dimensions. There's a variant with 11 dimensions. The issue is that they on the high-level dimension, or one issue that I have with it is that the high-level dimensions have a very clear emotional valence. So one of the high-level dimensions can be oceanic boundlessness, and that is essentially a positively experienced ego dissolution. The other one is called dread of ego dissolution, which is a negatively experienced ego dissolution, and the sensory ones are simple hallucinations, complex hallucinations, full stop. So there's no emotional valence. So ideally you would want to just either put it everywhere, so you also have positive visual hallucination and negative visual hallucinations, or you separate emotional valence and you make it its own dimension, which I think actually would be the better way of doing it. And then I think you'd find that actually emotional valence predicts a lot of what is happening. But then again, questionnaires don't really answer the question of this causal structure, right? You can find with a questionnaire that emotional valence, has results in more likely improvements, even though that's not always the case, because you can have a negative experience that is still very valuable. So again, all these things have limitations, right? You can do a nice study with questionnaire, but then that doesn't necessarily capture the single person that had a negative experience but still you know, they got something positive out of it in the longer term. Anyway, yeah, so that's a few things.
I think that's a good start.
Yeah. There's many more, but these are a few. Yeah. Any other questions? Did you have a question?
Okay.
Less of a question, more of a thought. Because from what you said, I'm the most interested probably in how you were saying that people are making or trying to make psychedelics that don't have
hallucinations.
Hallucinations to them. And to me, that sounds completely counterintuitive. I cannot imagine how you can have like a meaningful spiritual experience without the sensory component to it. So then I'm wondering, are there cases of that people took like high dose of psychedelics, had this experience but did not see hallucinations, or how would you look at that? Or
good. So there's two aspects to that question. The first one is, why are these people doing it? The main reason why they're doing it is that feel that there's a pretty big chunk of people that not only that they kind of don't think that the subjective experience is important at all. So even for example, you can try to talk about neuroplasticity, and you can say, what the reason why psychedelics are useful is that they elicit neuroplasticity in your brain, and it doesn't matter what experience you're having; it's just neuroplasticity, some positive, impact. And this is only based on studies in mice, and of course, there's a lot of there's some limitations to study mice. I mean, it can be very powerful. Of course, it's extremely powerful to do studies in animal, but of course, does it necessarily capture the whole complexity of what is going on in a human? No. And there's another famous joke that says, we cure depression every week in mice. So there's a paper every week that comes out saying, we cure depression because they kind of abolished some effect, some correlate of depression in mice. But of course, the mice doesn't tell you. So you have to swim. Yeah. You have to they do pretty weird thing. You have to immobilize them and do all kind of weird things to make them depressed, basically, and then try to solve that. So it's a whole So if you start from that assumption, let's say, if you start from saying the subjective experience is not important at all, it's just a side effect. I think that it's obviously not my perspective, but if you start from that, then I understand why you would want to try to, if you see it as a side effect. But I think most people that actually have experience with personal experience with psychedelics, rarely would say that the experience itself didn't matter. The other part of the question was that if there are people that have maybe a non-sensory experience, but it's still valuable. I think I have seen at least one case of that. It was, I think I've seen someone saying, there's a condition called aphantasia, basically, which is when people cannot visually, mentally project. It's basically like a lack of ability to visually imagine. It comes in degrees. So there's for some people it's ways, like someone that is an architect, maybe can fully visualize like a whole building, in their head, and someone else cannot do it at all. And then there's the whole spectrum of people in the middle. So there's some contrasting. There's some individual reports of people saying, "Oh, I have a fantasia," and would say that I have visual hallucinations. There's people that say I have a fantasia and I don't have any hallucinations, but I still have a useful, it's still valuable for me. Like I still have some kind of sense of insight, or there's still something happening, even if it's not a sensory experience. That does not mean that, it's a bit like the music thing of before, like the example with music, if somebody, can you listen to a piece of music and not have any, emotional response? Sure, it's possible, but it doesn't mean that music doesn't elicit or cannot elicit emotional responses. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but because from what I understand, when they're trying to make a hallucinogen without the hallucinations, they want, for example, for therapeutic purposes, they want someone, let's say, I'm going to simplify, to cure depression, let's say, but not put them through the whole, oh my God, I'm saying so many things. Right? But then, if you then it would presuppose that there's something up, like something that if a subjective experience matters, if let's start from this,
Sure.
that there two, it either matters or not. So if it matters, then what part of it matters if not the sensory experience? Or maybe sensory in some other modality, maybe not visual,
Sure.
but something else.
Yeah.
But then, I don't know how. I'm really bad.
That makes sense. I mean, so if we move to the camp of people that think that subjective experience matters, within this camp, there's a couple of opinions, right? So one opinion is, in my opinion, is that a multitude of dimensions of experience matter. The sensory ones, but then there's also this high-level dimensions of experience. So, for example, the sense of self, the sense of awe, mystery, ineffability. So, like all these are high-level dimensions of experience that are generally thought to be instantiated in higher-level regions and networks, like the default mode network. So most people, even in the camp that is in favor of subjective experience, most people would say, the visual, okay, that is happening, but it's not that important. What is important is that you have, a spiritual experience or a mystical experience, or an experience of awe, or this kind of. But they see that as unrelated from the sensory part of the experience, whereas, I don't think it is. Does that make sense? Just yeah.
But you can have mystical type experiences without any hallucinations with, for instance, in meditation. Or sometimes people have spontaneous mystical experiences.
100%. But it's again the music analogy, right, that I made, just because can I make you listen to a piece of music and that doesn't, or can you have an emotion? The comment, what you're saying now would be, the analogy would be, is it possible to have an emotional, valuable experience in your life without music? Sure, it is possible, right? There's many other ways to have a valuable emotional experience. Does the truth of this statement, does it imply that music cannot give you a positive and valuable experience? It doesn't, right? So they don't invalidate each other. So I fully accept that there are ways that you can have a valuable experience, a spiritual experience, an experience of awe, and an experience of whatever you want that is not caused by in a bottom-up way by the sensory phenomena. But that doesn't mean that this doesn't happen as well. I think this happens a lot, and I think it's a very valuable. I think it's possible to recognize that psychedelics have different therapeutic avenues, so they can have positive impact and also negative impact in multiple ways, and so. One of them, I think, is through an experience that is rooted in sensory domains. But maybe it can also be different between different people, right? Because some person might react better to a sensory kind of experience. Another person might instead not want to have this sensory aspects of experience. They might prefer something more like meditation or an absence of sensory content. But again, an absence of sensory content is not an absence of sensory experience. So. An aspect of sensory experience is anesthesia, and I don't know many people that say that anesthesia is a valuable, is a valuable. But so this also, to go back to this development of non-hallucinogenic psychedelics, we don't have to fight. It's not a negative thing. And someone said another analogy that makes sense there. It's a bit like non-alcoholic beer, Just because there is non-alcoholic beer, it doesn't mean that it does not take anything away from beer, or because there is decaffeinated coffee, it doesn't take anything away from coffee. So, but someone might, on a certain occasion, might prefer, decaffeinated coffee, or might prefer non-alcoholic beer. It might be better for one person, it might be better for you at a certain moment. So, it's not something that I think should be seen as in opposition, unless they explicitly make it that, unless they explicitly say. No, you can't do everything that the classical psychedelics do with the non-hallucinogenic version. But even those people, they don't say that. I don't think there's anybody making that claim, because they know it's not. It's easy to, it's easy to disprove that claim. So they always say things like I just said. Now there might be some person in a certain situation is more useful, is easier, and then it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be also doing stuff with classic psychedelics.
It serves different purposes. plain different ideas.
Yeah. It's again, I think it's useful. I'm sure that there will be some positive, some positive development out of it. I'm not sure, but I think it's plausible. I think it's plausible that there will be some positive development out of it.
And there was recently a study that looked at ketamine therapy for depression, and they actually showed no correlation between the subjective effects and the benefit of for depression.
Okay, so
ketamine. This was only one paper, so I
didn't see that, so I would be interested in reading that. So ketamine, well, we get into a different domain, because ketamine is not a psychedelic in my definition. I go by the chemical definition, so two-way agonist. So ketamine is not a psychedelic. Ketamine therapy is also very sketchy, because there isn't really there isn't really a curation of the experience. Most of I don't know the specific papers, so I don't know exactly what they did, but most of the time, especially in the US, there's this ketamine clinic where people go in, no preparation, they get an IV of ketamine, and then they go home. So there is no, they don't have any chance to prepare for the subjective experience that they have. They don't have any way to, any help in putting it together. A lot of times if someone goes to a ketamine clinic, it means that they don't want to do ketamine from the street, right? So then it probably means that they don't have experience with hallucinogens, which again, it makes it all the more likely that they're not going to be able to process the subjective experience in a useful way, because it means they're not the kind of person that would seek that experience outside of a very controlled, medical context. So yeah, I think there's lots of reasons why that probably doesn't correlate. But I saw that if you saw the COMPASS trials, which are the largest clinical trials today. So COMPASS is a large company that is involved in psychedelics, running the largest clinical trials with psilocybin for major depression. And they had the findings about a month ago, showing that essentially the correlations of the subjective experience aspect is there is a correlation with therapeutic benefits, and the sensory dimensions are correlate. I don't remember if it was not as strongly, but they correlate significantly with therapeutic outcome. And these are even the sensory dimensions in the 5D, the 5-dimensional altered state of consciousness. So they still don't really differentiate between, let's say, positive visual hallucination and negative visual hallucinations. So if you did that in a more balanced way, then I think it would be even more clear. So,
did you also see the paper by Groningen, so the University Medical Center? It was by Joost Brixema and others from the foundation. They have this paper titled "Holding On or Letting Go," a few months ago, and I think it did actually find some correlation between patients' difficulty letting go, kind of getting into the experience, and lower clinical outcomes.
In classic psychedelics?
In ketamine specifically.
Oh, okay.
Ketamine.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I would, again, saying sensory experience can be valuable, is a valuable mode. It doesn't mean any sensory experience is valuable, in the same way that not any piece of music is, you don't like any piece of music, at any moment, there's going to be a moment, there's going to be specific, something that is valuable at that moment. So, but you don't want to throw out old music, just because you don't like some music, Yeah.
I had another question. So you also mentioned anticholinergics a few times,
right,
and the full body, full complexity hallucinations. Mm-hmm. And you described kind of this continuum with classic psychedelics going from abstract to figurative hallucinations. Yeah. And the one Pablo Amaringo image, kind of the in-between.
Yeah.
That serotonergic psychedelics are kind of unique in that they can have this in-between.
Yeah.
Whereas with the anticholinergics or even someone experiencing psychosis, perhaps it tends to see these full material apparitions, like a person.
Proper hallucination.
Proper hallucination. So what do you think that tells us about how psychedelics affect the visual system? What's different or unique about the fact that there is an in-between with psychedelics, whereas with other substances there's not an in-between?
Right.
It's either there or it's not there. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Right. It's a good question. I mean, I can speculate. I can speculate.
Sure.
I'm not gonna. I don't have a I don't have a conclusive answer. I do think one aspect that matters is that even when you have figurative hallucinations with psychedelics, there are often these let's call them these abstract features. They always remain. They're always persistent, even when you have some kind of figurative hallucination arising out of that. So I think that's one aspect that makes it harder for psychedelic hallucinations to be confused with the perception of everyday reality. Because I could show you, so I think the content itself has an impact on the sense of reality that you attribute to the experience. It's an empirical question then, which exactly what is happening, like is there more activity, let's say in the low level visual regions with psychedelics compared to some anticholinergic hallucinogens maybe have some level of activity in regions that are higher parts of the visual system that are more for objects and faces and people and this kind of stuff. So it could be a region specific difference. It could be again just the characteristics, the visual characteristics of the hallucination that make it harder to confuse them with the percepts of everyday reality.
There's been no neuroimaging research with like scopolamine or atropine.
No, that's very sketchy. That's very hard to do. No, that's
also too dangerous.
Yeah, I would almost say that's impossible to do. Right? I don't want to say impossible, but nearly impossible. It's very hard to do research with psychedelics even right now.
I was actually about to ask you about the aphantasia because I think one of the theories there that it's about the connectiveness of the visual cortex with the prefrontal cortex, I think. And I don't know, to me that just kind of raises the question how we define a visual experience.
How it is. So first, I'm not an expert on like aphantasia as a clinical condition. So I wouldn't, I don't have any very insightful thing to say about that. I think I've definitely read at least one report of someone that said I have aphantasia, I don't have visual hallucination, but I still found this to be a valuable experience. But this is a very it's a very anecdotal thing, right? I don't even know if it's actually like placebo distinguishable. Like I don't even know if, because the placebo experience can be very beautiful and valuable and whatever you want. But about the specific thing that, how do we define a visual experience? From a subjective point of view, or from a neuroscience point of view?
I don't know. I guess I can only speak from my personal experience.
Sure.
Because I have aphantasia. And to me, like what you said on the like neuronal level, where about the motion, that just makes a lot of sense to me because I feel like I can perceive motion, but I don't see them.
You don't see stuff moving, but you know that something is motion. But
I don't. I can't look at it, but I still somewhat see it by the motion. It's hard, it's not easy to
Right. So there's a bunch of things happening. I mean, also again, not an expert on aphantasia. I don't know if it's. So there's also a difference between what you're conscious of course. So like what what aspects of what is happening in your visual system arrive to the part of your brain that is conscious, and what aspect there can be aspects that are happening. There's always actually things that are happening in your visual system that do not get to your, your conscious report awareness. So, so generally what we define as a visual experience is something that people can report. That's the easier definition, I guess, but it's more complicated.
There's I think a relatively high percentage of aphantasia with people on the autism spectrum, and actually like my best friend is on the spectrum, and he tried to explain it to me once. He said like, okay, so close your eyes and imagine a table, and I did, and he asked like, okay, what color is it? I said brown. Like, what material is it? I said it's wood. And he said if it were the reverse, and I would have asked him to do that, that he is imagining the concept of a table, but it doesn't have a color. There's no material. He doesn't even see the shape. So I think it would actually be interesting maybe to study this in people on the autism spectrum.
Yeah,
perhaps,
sure.
You know, to see if they are more able to produce a mental image somehow.
I think I don't know, it's interesting also with like, I don't know, ineffability of the experience, because I don't know if it's something visual, it's something that you can use, if it has a color, if it has a material, it's something you have some kind of vocabulary for, but then if it's not visual, how do you try to describe it?
I mean, I think there can definitely be visual experiences that are very hard to put in words, that are borderline impossible to put in words, for a number of, in a number of ways. You know, again, we were able to, we were able to describe a table because we learned what a table is. Like when you're born, when you're a child, you don't have, like, it takes time for a child to go from just like the input that is like to go from, there's just stuff on my retina and they don't have, you've probably seen, small children, they barely have like depth perception. They don't quite, distinguish objects from, from background and all these kind of things. So a lot of, our ability to describe visual things is learned. And so if you, so that implies that it's because you've seen it before that you can describe it. So if you, a lot of times when you're seeing something for the first time, it can be very hard to, it can be very hard to describe.